Welcome back, everyone. In tonight's video, we're diving into the eerie side of the nursing profession. Nurses often see things no one else does, standing between life and death every day. But sometimes, they encounter the unexplainable, events that go beyond medicine and science. These are real accounts from nurses who came face to face with the supernatural in hospital rooms, during late-night shifts, and in patients' final moments. So, get comfortable and prepare to listen to some haunting tales from those who've witnessed things they can't easily forget. Let's begin. Story number 1. I work in the labor and delivery department on the 3rd floor of the hospital. Directly below us on the 2nd floor is the ICU. One day, I got a patient who came in, a 47-year-old woman named Joanne who was pregnant. She seemed unhappy, never smiling. When I asked her name, she didn't respond at first. After asking about 4 times, she finally said, "Joanne." Joanne didn't want to lie in bed. She preferred sleeping in her chair. She had dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in a long time. I was a bit worried about her and her baby, hoping everything was okay with them. When I checked Joanne's history, it noted that she had a background of paranoia, depression, and hallucinations. No wonder she seemed to be suffering mentally. I told her I'd be back with a needle to start an IV in her arm. She asked what the IV was for, and I explained it was to give her medicine directly into her vein. She nodded and said, "Okay." When I returned, Joanne was sitting in the chair with her head down, snoring. I gently woke her up and told her I needed her arm to start the IV. She gave me her left arm and put her head back down, her hair covering her face. As I was inserting the IV, she suddenly said, "The hospital is a gateway for life and death. Below us is the ICU, where people die. Here is where people give birth to new life." Her words gave me goosebumps for some reasons. After I finished with the IV, she looked up and asked, "If it's between me and my baby, who would you save?" I was taken aback and asked her why she'd asked such a question. She repeated more intensely, "Listen, you beach, between me and my baby, who would you save?" Joanne's behavior was unsettling, like she was either high or possessed. I told her I didn't feel comfortable answering that question. She stood up, looked directly at me and said, "You must choose. The decision is yours to make today. Who will you choose to live and who will die?" She was acting terrifying, and I was a little angry that she'd insulted me. So without much thought, I told her I would choose the baby. Joanne laughed, pointed to herself and said, "Since you chose the baby, then this woman will die." Shaken, I left the room and reported the incident to my manager. My boss went into Joanne's room to speak with her, and after a while, he came out, shaking his head. "Joanne's not well," he said. At 6 p.m., the doctor arrived, and we took Joanne to the delivery room. She successfully gave birth to a healthy baby girl, but for some strange reason, she began to bleed heavily afterward. They rushed her to surgery, and after that, she was sent to the ICU. Later that night, she passed away in the ICU. Her blood and urine tests came back clean. She wasn't on any drugs. She seemed to be a clean, stable person, which left me wondering if she'd truly been mentally ill, or if something had possessed her. I couldn't forget her words. "Since you chose the baby, then this woman will die." I kept wondering who she meant by this woman. Was she talking about herself? It was one of the strangest experiences I've ever had as a nurse. Sometimes we get patients who claim that someone or something is after them, trying to kill them. These people hardly sleep. When they say things like that, we often think they're struggling with mental illness. But in Joanne's case, I wonder if there was something more, if she might have been possessed by something. Story number 2. I work in an old nursing facility. When this building was first constructed, it was for patients with tuberculosis. Many people passed away here during that time. Later on, the building was converted into a children's hospital. Nowadays, it's a place for sick and elderly people. In this building, both patients and staff often say they can hear or see little kids at night, especially when most of the lights are turned off for patients to sleep. After working here for 13 years, I've noticed something strange. Between December and January, the staff report that they rarely see or hear the little kids in the building. However, when we don't see or hear the children, it seems to be a bad sign. For some reason, most of our patient deaths occur during this time of year. The saying, "When they go in threes," always comes true between December and January. One January, a man was admitted to our facility. I was working the night shift at the time, and once again, there were no sounds of children laughing. It was eerily quiet. This man was here for physical therapy after knee surgery and was placed in room 7. During his 4-day stay, he would complain every night about seeing a tall, skinny girl with long fingernails who kept pinching him. He asked to switch rooms, but unfortunately, all the rooms were full. We had nowhere else for him to go. At night, he insisted that we leave the door open, keep the hallway light on, and even leave the light on in his room. Yet despite all this, he still complained about a dark, tall girl with long fingernails pinching him. On the 4th night, he was uncharacteristically quiet. There were no complaints. At midnight, my CNA went to check on him and found him lying in bed with his eyes wide open, foaming at the mouth. We called an ambulance, and another nurse and I went into his room to assist him and give him oxygen. We noticed nickel-sized bruises all over his body, as if someone had been pinching him. When the ambulance arrived, they took him to the hospital. They found fragments of the man's own skin under his fingernails. It turned out he had been scratching and pinching himself. Later, an investigation was conducted at our facility for possible abuse. After spending 4 weeks in the hospital, he passed away from other health complications. Sometimes I wonder why, when there are no children or sounds of their laughter at night, it seems to signal more deaths in our facility. I wonder if, during this time, the children are hiding from something or someone more sinister. Story number 3. In 1994, I was a home health nurse. My patients were mainly Hmong ethnicity at that time because many Hmong families were still adjusting to American life, so my manager frequently assigned me to Hmong patients. Plus, Hmong families often requested a Hmong nurse due to the language barrier. I remember one family I visited because their grandmother was sick and had a wound on her buttocks. She was paralyzed from the waist down due to a stroke 2 years earlier. She couldn't move her legs and was mostly in a wheelchair or bedbound. The day I arrived, I noticed 2 straw dolls hanging on their door. These straw dolls are usually used for repelling evil spirits. I knocked a few times on the door, and after a while, I heard the grandmother say, "Who is it?" I told her I was the nurse there to check on her wound and give her some medicine. After that, she opened the door and invited me in. It took her a while to reach the door as she was in a wheelchair. I asked if she was home alone, and she said yes. Her son and daughter-in-law were at work, and the kids were at school, so she was by herself. This was my first time meeting her. She was very thin, just skin and bones, with both her wrists covered in religious red strings. Again, these strings were used to repel spirits. I wondered about her situation. I explained that I was there to clean her wound and give her medicine, and asked her to lie down on the bed so I could examine it. We went to her bedroom, and she got onto the bed. Before taking off her pants, she told me not to be scared, that her late husband had died back in Southeast Asia, and even after death, her husband had followed them to America. She explained that after his death, he had become a tiger spirit and had been trying to take her with him, which is why, she said, she had grown a tail. She warned me not to be frightened if she showed her tiger tail to me. I assured her I wasn't scared, and just wanted to see the wound on her bottom so I could treat it. She lay down and took off her pants and underwear, turning toward the wall so I could see her back. The wound on her bottom was due to prolonged sitting and lying down. Her skin was breaking down, and the smell was strong. I could see her tailbone protruding. I realized this must be what she meant by growing a tail. It wasn't an actual tail, just her exposed tailbone, which everyone has. I cleaned the wound and packed it with gauze, then covered it with a dressing. She put her pants back on, and I helped her sit in her wheelchair. I gave her some pain medication and an antibiotic. Then I explained that while she might not be aware of it, all humans have a tailbone. When people stay in bed too long, the skin on their bottom can break down, causing a wound that exposes the tailbone. The grandmother nodded, but just as I finished speaking, we both heard heavy footsteps in the attic, as if someone was walking around up there. I looked up, unsure of what was making the noise, but it definitely sounded like someone heavy moving above us. She tapped my wrist and whispered, "You can hear that, but just stay quiet. Whenever my family isn't home, my husband comes as a tiger and stays in the attic. I hear him every day when I'm home alone. But if you can hear him, just pretend you don't." All my medical knowledge went out the window when she said that, and I heard those heavy footsteps in the attic. I didn't want to leave her alone, but my job there was done, and I had to see my next patient. The grandmother reassured me that she wasn't afraid to stay home alone. After all, it was just her husband that's up in the attic. She told me that in every house they'd lived in, they would hear heavy footsteps in the attic, heavy like a tiger's. She told me not to worry, and to go do my work. I thanked her and left. I visited that grandmother every week for 4 months until she passed away. It was one of the strangest experiences of my nursing career. Story number 4. I've been a nurse for a long time, and I've grown numb to death. I know that when I go home, I'm not supposed to bring my job with me. Whatever happens at work stays at work. When I was a newer nurse, I used to feel bad for people. I used to have sympathy for some of my patients, even when they made poor choices. But over time, I've become numb. When people make terrible life choices and die as a result, I don't feel anything. As I said, I've become numb to death. One night, I was assigned to a 28-year-old patient named Sam. Sam had been abusing alcohol and drugs for the past 2 years. He drank every day, lost his wife and kids, and eventually lost his job. He now lived with his father, and without him, Sam would be homeless. Sam was in the hospital because he had liver, heart, and kidney failure. When your liver and kidneys fail, toxins build up in your blood, and you can't urinate, so fluids accumulate in your body. In these cases, dialysis is needed. That night, Sam was my only patient, and I had to dialyze him. We put him through a slow dialysis called continuous renal replacement therapy. He seemed normal, lying in bed watching TV as I worked at bedside. Since he was my only patient, we had time to talk. Sam told me about his life and how much he missed his wife and kids. Unfortunately, he was abusing alcohol and drugs. Therefore, his wife took his kids away after the divorce. Around 11 p.m., Sam fell asleep. His father got off work and came to see him before going home, but when he arrived, Sam was already asleep. Sam's father and I stepped outside and talked for about 5 minutes. Sam's father told me that Sam hadn't been able to stop drinking since his friend passed away. Sam had once been a police officer, and one day he asked his friend to trade shifts with him. His friend agreed, so they swapped days. Tragically, on that day, Sam's friend was killed in the line of duty. Ever since then, Sam was overwhelmed with guilt and began drinking daily. Eventually, his wife and kids left him, and Sam refused to get help, choosing instead to drink himself to death. That's what Sam's father told me. I was Sam's nurse for 3 nights. We talked a lot, and I got to know him like a friend. But on the 3rd night, Sam's condition worsened, and he passed away while I was performing dialysis. At 3 a.m., my CNA and I cleaned him up and prepared his body for the morgue. After he was taken, I no longer had any patients, so I was allowed to go home. While driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about Sam. I knew I shouldn't bring my work home, but it felt like I was. I knew my wife and kid were both sleeping, but I didn't want to go home to them like this. I felt a bit sad, and tears filled my eyes. I pulled over to the side of the road near a canal. I decided I'd take out my fishing rod and fish for a while to clear my head before going home to my family. I didn't want to bring any sadness home. I went to the trunk, took out my fishing rod and some carp and trout bait. I baited my hook and cast into the canal, then sat there, just watching the water and waiting for a bite. About 20 minutes passed with no bites, but I was glad to be there at 4 a.m., enjoying the peace and quiet. Suddenly, a cop car pulled up behind me, and out stepped a young officer who introduced himself as Officer Paul. He asked if I was okay and if I needed any help. I told him I was fine, just taking a moment of peace before heading home to my family. We chatted a bit, and he mentioned that his grandfather was one of the men who had helped build the canal for the farmers back in the day. He even told me the canal was full of crappie fish and suggested I come back with crappie bait next time. After talking for a while, he advised me to be careful and thanked me for taking care of the sick and injured. Officer Paul shook my hand and walked back to his car. I watched him walk back, but then I looked again and there was no car behind mine. I never saw him turn on his lights or drive away. It's like him and his car just vanished out of thin air. At that moment, I was no longer sad. I was creeped out. I packed up and drove home to get some sleep before my next shift. The next night, I was back at work. Around 11 a.m., I got a call from Sam's father. He just got off work. He asked if I could retrieve Sam's laptop from the room where he had passed. I went to the room, checked the closet, and found Sam's backpack with the laptop inside. When Sam's father arrived, I handed him the backpack. He looked like he had just been crying, and I offered my condolences. He patted my shoulder and thanked me for taking good care of his son. Then I asked him the name of Sam's friend who had passed. Sam's father replied that his friend's name was Paul, Officer Paul. I felt chills run down my spine. Sam's father thanked me again and left. Story number 5. I don't know why, but ever since my brother Chaley moved in with my mother and me, she wanted him included in our life insurance policy too. It was so expensive. Chaley is older than me. He's 38, divorced, depressed, obese, has high blood pressure, and is diabetic. Adding him to our life insurance policy made it costly because of his medical issues. If Chaley would help out and get a job, things would be so much better. But he doesn't. He stays in his room playing video games. He drinks beer too, which doesn't help his diabetes or blood pressure. Then came 2020. I worked at the hospital and realized that the people dying from the virus were often those who were obese, diabetic, and had high blood pressure. My older brother, Chaley, was at risk. I felt I needed to protect him from the virus. I must do what I can to make sure that I don't catch the virus and take it home to my family. After nearly a year, some of my nurse co-workers caught the virus. These were people in good shape who only experienced mild symptoms like coughing, a runny nose, headache, and a mild fever. I was very careful and managed to avoid getting it. Every day I'd come home to find my mother cleaning the house. After a long day at work, I'd grab a soda to drink, then toss the can in the recycle bin, only to see all the beer bottles piled up in there. I didn't understand why I worked so hard to pay for everything, while Chaley just drank himself into worse health. Despite all my precautions as a nurse, I eventually caught the virus. I feel like it was inevitable, as I'm constantly around patients with the virus. My manager told me that since I tested positive, I'd need to stay home for 2 weeks. My coworkers advised me to avoid socializing if I had a fever, since that was when I'd be most contagious. When I'm not working, I'd stayed in my room, where I had my own refrigerator and bathroom. I didn't want to get my mother or brother, Chaley, sick. One night, though, I had a fever, was coughing, and had a headache, making it impossible to sleep. It was 2 a.m., and I wondered if Chaley was still up playing games online. I got out of my room, took 2 beer bottles with me, and went to Chaley's room. He was still up. I sat on his bed, handed him a beer, and we started chatting and playing Street Fighter online. It was fun, but I couldn't stop coughing. After about 2 hours, I took some Benadryl, got sleepy, told him I was going back to my room to rest. After 4 days, Chaley started coughing really badly. Even brushing his teeth made it hard for him to breathe, so we took him to the hospital. It's been 2 years now, and my mother and I have been getting by with the extra $180,000 from the life insurance. I do miss Chaley, though. He was my only older brother. My sisters and I loved him very much, but unfortunately, he became a victim of the pandemic. In 2023, I was at a friend's New Year's party and had a bit to drink. Once it turned midnight, my friends and I celebrated, each downing a beer. Around 2 a.m., people started leaving. The friend hosting the party told everyone to stay over until morning, but I only felt a little buzzed and wanted to go home since everyone else was leaving. At the time, I thought I was okay to drive. On my way home, as I turned onto the highway ramp, instead of going straight with the traffic, I saw the road curve into a circle. I followed the curve, not realizing I was driving against oncoming traffic. It was close to 3 a.m., so the highway was mostly empty, but a few cars passed me, flashing their high beams to signal I was going the wrong way. They swerved to avoid me. I was drunk and didn't realize I was on the wrong side. Then a blue car sped up alongside mine, and the person inside had their interior light on. He would match my speed, smile at me, then slow down, only to speed up and catch up with me again, smiling each time. That's when I realized it was Chaley in the car. Then he slowed down again. At that moment, I snapped out of my fog, and suddenly 2 trucks were approaching me fast, one in the fast lane and the other in the slow lane, honking at me. I quickly turned to the left side. My car went up onto the train track, and rocks flew everywhere as I braked hard. I stopped, taking a deep breath as my heart raced. I backed down, turned around, and sat for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I knew I was driving drunk, and that if I got caught, I'd be in serious trouble, possibly losing my job. After that, I drove home. Luckily, it was New Year's Eve, and while there were likely a lot of cops out patrolling, I didn't get caught. When I got home, I collapsed on the couch and slept. I didn't dream that night. The next night, though, I had a dream about Chaley. In the dream, he came to me and said he was leaving for good. He said he was just there to make sure that I'm okay that night when I was drunk driving. He told me to take care of myself, reminding me that I'm the youngest and that my mother would need me. I woke up crying. I don't know why, but I started feeling very emotional, and guilt has been eating at me every day since. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.